about how we have to wait and sit here while other people trick in and just stare at the screen. So, but instead of doing that, we're just going to drink.
I've gotten really good at staring at a screen. So
I have as well.
Still don't know.
This semester, Oh, I'm back to teaching in person this semester, and it's staring at people actually so much harder. I genuinely did not, like, I love teaching, but the one thing I did not miss is when you start teaching a class and you just know they didn't do most of the readings, and you ask a question and you're supposed to stare them down until one person, like, it's like prison, you know, like you're supposed to stare them down until one person attacks. And it doesn't work for me. I just feel really awkward. I have to fill the silence. So the way I fill the silence, I'll ask a question, they won't answer. I'll answer the question and then ask another one, they still won't answer. This time I asked progressively easier questions and it didn't work either. And I just ended up answering all the questions.
Oh yeah, no, I totally get that. I had this problem, not in class recently, but with the open mic night I hosted on Wednesday, where because it was a cafe lounge vibe, we didn't take performance slots in advance and reserve them. So it was a matter of you come up of your own volition. And I was like, but volition is a word I'm going to use loosely, and I'm just going to stare daggers at you until you come up and have something moving to recite for us.
Did you do medieval stand-up?
I didn't. So I did, however, well, this is very incriminating, but it's also, as my colleague said, a story that I'll tell for the rest of my life, probably. I read 2 different poems. One of them was by Mohja Kef, who's a contemporary poet, Syrian-American, moved from Damascus in like the 1970s. And it's a wonderful poem about her grandmother doing wudu in like a Sears bathroom, like making ablution for prayer in like a Sears bathroom in the Midwest with all the white ladies like staring at her going, what is happening? So that was wonderful. But then for the second poem, because we were into the second hour of the evening, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun if I do something unsettling and daring in order to sort of jostle people into excitement to come up and read something and also break the ice a little bit again for the newcomers? I picked a poem by Abu Nuwas, who is a mid-late 8th century Abbasid era, basically wine song poet, but also a person who is very open about his homoerotic tastes. And this poem combined the best of all worlds in that he basically gets drunk and then goes whoring with his friends, or such is the narrative.
The best kind of poem.
Yes. So truly wonderful, except that I was reading the poem. I had done all this historical contextualization to explain why I'd picked this poem and, you know, all of the profound rationale behind my professorial decision. And I'm halfway through the poem into the whoring section where I'm using that exact phrase multiple times in a row. And the dean of the college walks in. So if you guys, if I don't make it long in a new position.
Oh, it's okay. I have an equally embarrassing story that's related to, we were talking about Twitter beforehand and our personalities on Twitter. I started this thing like 4 or 5 years ago. It was like my second year of grad school, where it was the first time my parents set me up on an arranged marriage date. And they guilted me into it. I go all the way to Oakland to this cafe, and it's like, he's like half an hour late. So I'm live tweeting the whole thing because he uses the restroom a few times and, like, you know, he's not paying attention. And then the next day in seminar, my professor is like, I saw your tweets. And I was like, no, Jesus. Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on that note, we should introduce the.
We should probably like officially start. I mean, I have my own open mic story, which maybe I'll share, you know, towards the end. You know, but yes. I also want to ask you, because it's my understanding that people in the past never had sex too. So this is blowing my mind. That's
so much sex and they talked about it vigorously in poetry. And in Abu Nuwas's case, they used a lot of metaphors from religion to talk about it, to be intentionally even more scandalous. Anyway, I'll shut up. Yes, please.
Yeah, no,
I love that.
That's great. We're going to get back to that in just a minute. So welcome everyone to Drinking with Historians. I am Matt. I'm joined by Varsha, your co-host. And of course, our guest today is the wonderful Dr. Rachel Schine, who's an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. We're going to talk about more than sex, but maybe not. I don't know what's going to happen. But we're so pleased for you to join us. But the first question that we have to ask before we get back to the whoring is about the drinking. So Rachel, what are you drinking tonight?
Okay, so I should preface this by saying I took a little Twitter informal poll on what I should drink, and everyone said that I should either bring arak, which is a regional liquor from the Middle East that tastes a lot like anise and has a cool color changing effect, or nabid, which is basically date wine. And I failed epically and could not find it in my local shop, so I'm drinking Bullet, which is a bourbon, very American, except now syndicated internationally. So less American than it used to be.
Yeah. Excellent. Varsha, what about yourself?
I decided to go with one of my favorites, Bunhaben. I think it's Bunhaben, number 12. It's great because unlike my other scotches, it's not as sweet. It's more like vanilla-y and creamy, and the actual like smokiness sort of comes from like wood, I sort of think. Again, I'm not like my palate isn't perfect, but it's not as peaty as others, and it's a great scotch.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you even have the fancy glass for it too.
I do. Yep.
I would be disappointed if you didn't have that, honestly, if you didn't have the fancy glass. So I made myself a fancy cocktail tonight, a La Louisiane, which is rye whiskey and sweet vermouth and a little bit of Benedictine, which is kind of like an Amaro, kind of a sweeter, it's very similar to sweet vermouth there. And then it has a little bit of absinthe and some Peychaud's bitters, a very kind of New Orleans-y drink. And the rye I'm using is actually a brand new one that I just found. I think it's been out for a little while, but I just found it in our local thing. It's the Uncle Nearest rye, which if you've been watching Drinking with Historians for a while, you remember Tracy from way back when was from Uncle Nearest. And it's a really wonderful rye there. So cheers, everybody, and welcome to Drinking with Historians. So let's get back to the whoring, because, so Rachel, you were talking about, it was an 8th century poet.
Yeah.
So, and we tend to think of people in the past and even people today, right, as kind of separating kind of religion and carnal things of the world. I mean, one of the things that medieval European Christians did a lot was actually blend, but you're saying this is true as well in the Abbasid period.
Oh, absolutely, and I'm sure earlier and definitely after. And people often did it in ways where they knew that they were pushing boundaries when they did so, and would hedge at times in fascinating fashion. So I just taught a unit in my Islam in the Body class on Hajj, which is obviously a very embodied experience, but also for people who say were Muslims who had converted in China under the Yuan dynasty and stuff like that. It was also a disembodied experience that they would probably never get to have. So we talked about physicality and the cerebral component of Hajj and all this sort of stuff. But one of the things I want to talk about is things like the hashtag #MosqueMeToo movement and how people have dealt with the prospect of being sexually harassed or assaulted during one of the most sacred experiences you could have in your life. And I was looking for sort of some pre-modern examples of language around this and examples of this happening. And it turns out that there is a short poem recited by one of Muhammad's companions, so going all the way back to being contemporary with the life of Muhammad, where he's on Hajj, he's assumed the state of ihram or ritual purity to do so. And he recites this line about watching women swaggering by in front of him. And people say, you're going to recite this when you're in ihram? Like, that's obscene. You're not supposed to do that. God says there should be no obscenity during Hajj. And he's like, no. It's only obscenity if I meant human women. I was actually talking about the camels over there. And the light steps were referring to their footsteps. And he sort of like does this little turnabout. And it makes you wonder, because you don't know the person's intention, obviously. Was that what he meant? Or is the little interpretation he gives us at the back of his metaphors through poetry actually the legit example?
Wow.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that kind of turnabout, right? Is that because they know that they're playing with boundaries, right? Like I'm thinking about, for example, like 12th and 13th century troubadour poetry, for example, which is a very similar thing, in which they're talking about like horses, for example. They're not talking about horses, really, right? Like they're talking about the spiritual experience of kind of riding your horse and stuff like that. And it's just like, yeah, dude, like you're not, no, like,
Right.
But there's like that plausible, well, supposed plausible deniability, but then you have to think about the social context in which these are created, right? And the power dynamics that are involved as well. So yeah, so it's really interesting. And yeah, sorry, Varsha, I interrupted you.
Oh, I was just gonna say, one of the most interesting things about me is not me, sorry. One of the most interesting things about early modern period, specifically the Middle East, is that I only got to take part of a class on it. I ended up having to drop it for something else. And you brought up gender. And basically I've spoken to people who had to teach the history of the Middle East at Berkeley. And one of the major questions or things they had to deal with when they were teaching it is how people today, Muslim or not Muslim, sort of deal with the issue of sexism and gender, and sort of how do you sort of teach that, and how do you sort of deal with that? You're just bringing up, this weird turnabout in this poem. So how do you sort of deal with modern ideas about sexism or misogyny in early modern Arabic literature or in Arabic history?
That's a really good question. I mean, I usually take the lead from people who have dealt with this question much more intelligently than I have. So, for example, in my Islam in the Body class, I, in the first week, assigned writings by Muslim feminist women they are observant in the tradition, they are engaged with the tradition in order to write about it. I assigned work by Zahra Ayubi and Keisha Ali. And I basically posed that question to the students of, if as these authors are characterizing the tradition, there are all these flaws, there is all this misogyny, both latent and explicit, why engage with it at all? What are these authors doing by doing so? And the basic conclusion that we come to, or that I hope we came to together as a class, is that the methodologies behind the tradition and the learning of the mostly men who stood behind that tradition was sincere and was highly interrogative and was highly concerned with getting it right. And yes, right has changed over time, but that means that in many ways you can still be using those hermeneutic tools and focusing in on the logic behind how the rules got made as opposed to how they were applied or how unevenly they were applied, in order to sort of situate yourself in the modern day as a person who would be asking the same questions and maybe coming to different answers. So basically, I ask it as a combination of who's speaking, like how do we know what we know, and whose voices were heard throughout history, and then when people pick up what was put down by those other folks, how much are they dismantling, how much are they retaining, and how much are they sort of taking maybe the spirit but not the law, or the method but not the content, and doing things with that in innovative ways.
Building on that, because I don't know a lot about this, is most of the literature you're reading in this pre-modern period by men, or are there women who are publishing maybe under surname, not pen names, or publishing under their own name?
Yeah, I mean, so there are definitely tons of women in the pre-modern Islamic world who wrote and whose writings were preserved. And that question is really the operative question, because I'm sure that you have many women who, for example, had the education to extemporize beautiful poetry that wasn't written down for various reasons or was elided from the record for various reasons. And you also have plenty of women who were not educated or who were semi-literate and who never were in the right social networks, therefore, to have their ideas committed to text in a way that was enduring. So, I mean, there's, the sort of all-star cast of people that I always put on my syllabi for things like a survey of Islamic civilization, whatever we mean by that. And there are several women in there, but it's very much, and this is one of the things I talk about with my students, it's conditioned on a combination of class and which part of the tradition they were engaged with. So for example, there's a lot more literature by Sufi women that got preserved because Sufism was also sort of populist and accessible from the get-go in a way that things like speculative theology were not, that we have, that is still extant now.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I mean, like one of the things that I found when I've taught kind of pre-modern subjects, especially kind of subjects around religion, around gender, race, which I want to ask you about in a while, is that in some ways I think it makes, or at least my experience, like sometimes it makes it a little bit easier for the students because there's the time distance because you can pedagogically, you know, like as a teacher, you can say like, listen, like this happened a long time ago. Like, what is the source saying? Who is the person that's, as you were saying, like, who's the person that's speaking? What is the audience? Like, we can leave aside these other questions just for a moment and just like, let's go back and talk about what the text is actually trying to do. I mean, does that seem to work too, like in your experience as well? Or is it something that the students kind of push back on, have you found?
You mean the sense of distance sort of allowing you to make
Yeah,
more space for
yeah.
these questions? Yes and no. I think so my classes very happily are super diverse in terms of the student body that's taking them. I get a lot of students who have either heritage in the Middle East and Africa. I'm teaching in Islam in Africa and the African diaspora class right now too. So tons of students with, you know, quote unquote skin in the game in that class. I get lots of students from the Maryland area, which is itself very diverse. There's a large like Ethiopian population here, for example. And I have a lot of students who say, you know, oh, I'm from a country that has a lot of Muslims, but I'm not Muslim and I want to learn more about it. And that's why I'm in your class. And I find that different people bring different things to the table, and people who feel more embedded in this history are going to deal with it differently than people who are already less embedded. And there's already that bit of distance that, you know, is perceived, maybe not as, you know, maybe that evolves during the trajectory of the class, but yeah.
Do you want to ask about race, or I can ask about, just because I looked up a couple of the papers you read, and the first two that I saw were one about race in Islamic studies and one about race and Blackness in pre-modern literature. And so we all know, you know, race did not exist in Europe in the pre-modern era. How did you manage to figure out that race does exist in the pre-modern Islamic world? And what did these writers have to say about race? And so how do you sort of teach about racialized Blackness?
So sure. So one of the main anxieties on the European studies, especially Romance languages, you know, post-Latin side of it, is with just the question of the term race itself. Can we speak of this avant la lettre before the word is there? Is this there? And frequently, when you're working in a language that has nothing to do with those other languages, you can unburden yourself of that concern and ask a different kind of question.
Just forget the French ever existed.
Right. So like what I say a lot to people is, even though my work is very much about historicizing processes of what I'm calling racialization, I'm very clear with, you know, it's not as if people were calling it that in the Middle East or in the Arabophone world or in the Islamic world, whatever we're going to call it. And that's okay, because the methods and critical posture given to us by things like Black studies and by things like critical race studies still helps us analyze what was going on. And we still can use a comparative mode in order to get at better history of the pre-modern Middle East. So basically, the reason that I came to this set of questions is because some of that theorization hadn't sort of happened yet in the field, or it hadn't happened in a way where people had taken the sort of building blocks and added to the edifice very consistently. And more or less what happened was I got into this topic by setting out to do a dissertation project on gender in Arabic popular literature, and then encountering this story by one of the sort of archetypal heroines of Arabic popular literature, or about her rather, in which she has a child who spontaneously and through seemingly nothing to do with either her heritage or her husband's heritage is born Black. And everyone's calling him Black and saying he looks like a Nubian, and clearly like racializing him as being very different from the rest of his family, to the point where it precipitates a paternity case, and they take him to different judges and the whole story unfolds. And then he has to have his legitimacy certified as her child. And then the story goes on, and this kid becomes her sort of co-star and becomes a hero in his own right, very much while still being considered Black by all of his peers. And I looked for literature on race and pre-modernity and came up against this exact argument that, oh, well, it didn't exist, so you can't talk about it. And I was like, but clearly I need to, because otherwise I can't talk about this story. So it was very much the text leading me in the direction of this question of, first of all, what does Blackness mean in the pre-modern Arab Islamic context? Second of all, what conflating and essentializing and flattening work is it doing? Who is being subsumed under this label? And then third of all, how is that label being imbricated into the matrices of power that existed in the pre-modern Muslim world through its attachment to things like class and things like unfreedom and things like gender? So it all just sort of, clearly it spiraled, much more than I thought it was going to, and it became my dissertation, and now is my life.
As is every dissertation. I started with one tiny thing in the late 80s, and now it's the whole 20th century. So
And
yeah.
all dams.
It's
all dams.
Listen, if I had more time and more languages, if I had as many languages as Rachel does, I would be doing dams in African countries as well as Latin American countries, because it all mashes together. Like, if I could go back in time and learn Urdu, my life would be so much different right now, or Bengali.
So, I mean, Rachel, I'm fascinated by this idea that you can study the pre-modern world without Romance languages, but we can leave that to the side for a moment. But I'm interested. You were talking about the importance of context, right? Is like what is this term? This identification of this character in the story as Black. Like, what does it mean, and how does it relate to all these kind of other categories? Like how widespread was this, in the Arabic literature of the period that you're studying? And can you kind of contextualize like what period you are specifically talking about?
Sure. So basically, for my actual book project, the texts that I'm working with are texts that are, well, I should say they are first attested in the 12th century. What I mean by that is they're popular texts. So these are works that existed in oral, word of mouth, passing stories around folklorically sort of contexts well before they ever get committed to paper. And when they start getting committed to paper, a few things happen. First is, of course, you start to, well after they actually begin getting committed to paper, see a manuscript footprint for them. So a lot of our manuscripts are actually from about 200 years later in the Mamluk period. But second of all, once you start committing stories to paper, the elite class of storytellers, the udabet, the men of pens and learning, start to pay attention a little bit more and go, what is this new thing homing in on our turf? And so you get a proliferation of mentions of them in other texts. So basically, that puts us, if we're thinking 12th century, we're thinking like late Abbasid period, but in order to historicize, like, how did these things materialize on paper in the first place? And I do mean paper, because by then the Middle East, unlike Europe, had paper. Sorry, I have to a little bit. Anyway, I have to be talking about basically the preceding period, and therefore I'm very much in the Abbasid period, sort of straddling, I guess you could say, the Abbasid and the Mamluk period in order to do my work.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Varsha.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so you've mentioned Europe a lot, and this is one of the questions that Matt talked about before, and I don't actually know if I'm phrasing this question right, but I think I'll phrase it this way. Do people not people in Europe, but do people in this Arabic period that you're studying, in these two periods you're studying, do they recognize Europe as a single entity? Are they engaging with European, not just European texts, but European people? And how does that sort of affect your research, right? Because we're trying to pull away from this Eurocentrism. So you're not interested in how like Europeans are, interested in the Arabic world, but you're doing the opposite. So how does that sort of come out in your research?
Yeah, I mean, the territorialization of what we would call Europe in Islamic geographies from the Abbasid period is, it's much more both atomized and relational than I think we would intuitively think if we're thinking, oh yeah, like the Muslims had like books of Ptolemy and they made maps, like go Muslims. So one of the things that you see, for example, is that, and Zaid Antrim has written a lot about this, and she has this whole, book on mapping traditions in the Islamic Middle East, is that, so there's sort of two countervailing sets of mapping traditions, and one of them is mapping the territories in which Islam was the dominant religion, which is not to say the majority religion, but rather that Muslims were in power in these places. So the Mamalik al-Islam, the kingdoms or realms of Islam. And if you're thinking about the, like much of the Abbasid period anyway, that means that you're excising out most of Spain and Portugal and Sicily and various other Mediterranean islands at various times, and saying those are parts of the Islamic world, quote unquote. In terms of like broad distinctions that I often see, there's an understanding that there's a set of nations that belong to the Ifrenj, that belong to the Franks in Muslim writings. And there's an understanding that to their east lies a set of properties that belong to Rum, so Byzantium. However, once Muslim dynasties start to occupy that space that had belonged to Byzantium, they don't retire that language. They don't say, oh, this is no longer Rumi because like I'm here now. They call themselves the Sultanate of Rum and things like that. Or like Jalaluddin Rumi has the title because, you know, he lived a lot of his life in Anatolia and he dies in Konya. So you see both ideas that there are these large, broad-based territories that are somewhat culturally coalesced, usually around things like their perceptions of empire and of religion as well. And also that that's still not saying there's a reified Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And do you see people, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just gonna say, do you see people in this, in these two periods you're studying, sort of trying to translate or maybe not use works, but sort of reading works from these Franks and these Romans and sort of understanding these two different languages, and it's like developing into a new type of literature or sort of inspiration from these European powers that are not really European yet?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, there's the entire sort of Abbasid so-called translation movement, where you have a lot of high officials, including caliphs, commissioning the translation of texts from mostly Greek and Syriac, or Greek via Syriac, but also Sanskrit via Pahlavi, or Sanskrit via Persian rather. And so one of the things that, and this is like not my area, so this is like something that I teach to people, but it's not something that I like intimately know. But one of the things I think is really interesting, and that Dimitri Gutas sort of argues, is that in the Islamic conceptualization, when they were thinking about translating late antique wisdom from these different cultures, they weren't viewing there necessarily being a hard and fast bounding line between the Greek and the Persian contexts, because you have various examples that get taken up in Islamic tradition in really interesting ways of there being bridge figures. And the key one here is Alexander the Great, obviously, who is also given prophetic status as Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran, and is a figure that Muslims reverence. So it's sort of both yes, and if they were taking this as inspiration, they weren't necessarily taking it as inspiration that was specific to you over there and not you over here. There was an understanding that already people had been bridging these divides, like the Sasanians had been bridging these divides and stuff like that, and that they were sort of, that was the inheritance of the Abbasids to do so.
Yeah. I think one of the great things that I love the way that you're talking about this is that too often, I think in the popular understanding, certainly in the American context, definitely, but even in kind of a like scholarly context of pre-modern European studies, right? They tend to think of this, you know, the Arabic world as kind of monocultural and monolingual, right? It's like everything's in Arabic, everything is kind of Islamic, right? But you're reminding us, like, no, there's other languages, there's other literary traditions, there's lots of different kind of political entities that are competing with one another and working in different ways. And like, you know, historians, European historians, like foolish people like me, like kind of understand that in a vague way, but just like, it's just like weird, different, you know, alphabets and stuff like that. So, but that kind of, this is a long way of getting to a question actually from the audience, and then I want to get back to something else that you mentioned too, is they were asking about like how much do people kind of move in this period, like within the within kind of the wider Middle East, North Africa, and then within Europe, and that kind of goes to what Varsha was talking about as well, is like would you see people of different kind of racialized identities, or for, you know, different genders or different kind of political and cultural backgrounds, like moving in these spaces in the periods in the 12th, you know, through the 14th, 15th centuries that you're interested in?
Yes. So A, tons of movement, and B, movement along trajectories that again are super class and, per your point, like racially and ethnically dependent. So if you're going to be moving, or be moved, I should possibly say, great distances in the Islamic world, there are basically two ways that is happening. Call it three. One is that you are somebody who has the means to travel and has undertaken that travel either for diplomatic ends or for something like talab al-ilm, the seeking of knowledge, where if you were the sort of person who was an individual of learning but lived at the peripheries of the Islamic world, so say Morocco, super far west, and you want to, I don't know, take a, say, rihla, a la Ibn Battuta, who literally does this and is born in Tangier, and like go all the way across the world while making Hajj, and then extend that further to see how many people can, like, have appoint me as a local judge for a period of time, and then what can I see of their side of the world, and who can I hobnob with and rub elbows with and all this sort of stuff. And then he writes this all down for us, and it's this amazing trove of resources to teach with. So maybe you're an individual like that. Maybe you are a person from the merchant classes who was, say, plying the Indian Ocean, or who was crossing the Sahara regularly, or who was crossing the Mediterranean regularly. Or maybe you are somebody who, in that world of commerce, was themselves commodified. So maybe you are somebody who is from sub-Saharan Africa, who is brought northward and thence, say, across from Egypt overland into the Arabian Peninsula, or who's brought across the Red Sea into places like Jeddah, or who's brought across the Mediterranean, and makes your way into parts of Europe and parts of the Middle East and parts of Central Asia even, or maybe you do that via the Indian Ocean. Or maybe you're someone from like the, Central Asian steppes, and you're doing it in the opposite direction, but for the same reasons.
Yeah. I think, just to follow up on that, if I can too, I mean, I think that, that we tend to think when we're talking about kind of the permeability, if you will, of this period and how people did move, we tend to focus a lot on kind of willing motion. And I think this is really important, even something like in the Bright Ages, David and I tried to emphasize is the slave economy, of what's going on. And that brings me to another thing that I wanted to ask you about, is that recently the American Historical Review, the flagship journal of the American Historical Association, did a series of essays on the 1619 Project. And you contributed a really wonderful essay on that as well. And so, like, could you talk a little bit about just like kind of how you got involved in that project, like how kind of you were asked, or how you got invited to do that, and then B, kind of what you talked about and how that kind of contributed, because I think everybody, like, I think most people know about the 1619 Project. It's excited such a political and cultural kind of commentary here, but we don't think of it as something that extends beyond the American context, but it really does, right? So
yeah, absolutely. So to your initial points about the logistics of the thing, I have no idea how I got involved. I got invited completely out of the blue. I sort of did the thing that I usually do, and that I kind of advise people to do if they're either hinky about the politics of doing something, or if they're hinky about just, is this the right venue for me, all this sort of stuff, which is I asked about the roster of other people that they had involved. And I really felt, after I saw both the roster and considered how exciting it would be to be able to write something about this, that I couldn't say no. So I did. Yeah, so the American Historical Review invited 19 scholars who work on global history. So it was about an even split between people who work on American history in different periods and people who work on other parts of the world entirely, who work on China, Mongolia, the Islamic world from various angles. So Elaine Mikhail, who's an Ottomanist, was in there. Eve Trout Powell, who works on sort of more early modern Egypt-Sudan relations, was there, and me. And the reason that I found it so do global history or history of my parts of the world that I focus on through 1619 is because at the sorts of edges of the project, in various ways, there are so many relations with the Islamic world that are discussed. And that's something that other reviewers teased out. But in addition to that, there are also just methods and modes of interpretation that are used in that book that are really instrumental for thinking about things like ethnogenesis, the movement of frontiers, diaspora, indigeneity. And that's the sort of side of it I chose to focus on, was which methods can I take and apply. A few other reviewers very aptly noted things like, for example, there's an entire section on sugar and the sugar industry, And
Yeah.
that's very much contextualized in the history of sugar's movement through Asia and the Middle East to get to Europe in the first place in various ways, and thence into the Atlantic world. So that would be an example of accessing what I do in a different way.
Interesting. So if one sort of last question I have is basically, you work a lot on Arabic literature specifically, that's what your research is on. And I asked about gender and race already, but specifically when it comes to class and politics, because that's the sort of the mindset I come in from, and I come in from foreign policy. How does the writings of the periods that you're looking for sort of affect not just the politics of the world, like the domestic politics, but how does it maybe affect the foreign policy, right? So maybe the periods you're looking for, they're kings or sultanates that are expanding eastward or westward or northward. How what kind of writings that you read are like clearly political, right? Not just poems about the Hajj. And then I have one about the Hajj after that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question because it's hard to imagine writings that aren't somehow political. So I'm actually trying to think of like a particularly useful way of answering it. Maybe I'll answer it with something that I've been working on as kind of a side project right now, that fell out of the work for the book, which is the fact that there are many scenarios in these Arabic epics where you not only have examples of Black heroes, like the story that I told you about before, where there's this incongruousness, though, that's embedded in this idea that you could have someone who's both Black and Arab from his birth story forward. But you also have examples of just sort of generalized what people have usually passed off as trickster antics, where people will radically change the way that they look in order to phase into different parts of society or go unnoticed by certain people that they usually would be under scrutiny of. So this involves, for example, changing one's skin color. There are, in other words, stories in medieval Arabic literature of people more or less blacking up. And I really wanted to think with what that means, with whether or not I can use people who've worked on performance theory, people who've worked on blackface to understand what's going on there. And in the process of doing my background research for this, I actually ended up looking into, and this text is fully translated, by the way, in a beautiful edition by the Library of Arabic Literature, so you can read this in English, a book called The Book of Charlatans by a Mamluk era dude from Syria named Ibn al-Jawbari. And he talks about the fact that he says, oh, when I was in Anatolia, he has this entire chapter about charlatans or chicanery that involves people who dye other people, either their skin or their hair, or manipulate their faces in order to make them, again, go through these social processes that they normally would not be able to go through or that they normally would not be impressed into. And there's this entire section where he says, okay, so I was in Anatolia, I was at one of the slave markets there, and they do all these preposterous things, like they'll dye somebody Black so that their family won't recognize them if they come by. And which is like truly both wild that, it was presumed that that would be a possible feint that one could pull, or at least one that was plausible enough that's making it into this book of charlatanism that's basically a book of admonitions, albeit tongue-in-cheek, about how to not get conned. And also, this is an instance where it's so clearly political, but in a very subtle way, in the sense that it's politics very much from below. You're talking about people who sell slaves in markets that basically intersect the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, at which there would have been therefore fewer Black people, but nonetheless, in a testament to that movement that I was talking about, these trades were interconnected enough that there would have been some. And they're manipulating the appearance of people from further north in order to basically take them away from their families. Or in some cases, they said, Ibn al-Jabari is or to help them abscond from, if they're in trouble or something. So it was both a mode of escape and a mode of captivity. And there's something both very political there and also very much not political in terms of the high palace court intrigue sort of politics that we think of when we think of that.
Yeah.
But also
my last oh, go ahead. Sorry, Matt, you go first.
No, I was just going to say, you can ask your question. It's just a comment, really. It's just and just reminding, I think too, with that anecdote is just how deeply human these people were, right? And I think, I was saying earlier, the distance, the time period distance oftentimes helps students understand that, like, deal with kind of difficult topics, but it also kind of makes everything black and white, if that makes sense, right? Like not real in a certain sense, like, about kind of the suffering that enslavement, some of the violence that our texts, talk about, like, must have been to experience at that time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Also, I
I
realize
was gonna,
even a jabari, it's actually just a jabari. I'm sorry.
oh, yeah, I was gonna ask. So one of the most difficult things for me to teach, because I just have no relation to it whatsoever in any sort of sense, is the history of religion. So if I'm teaching the history of religion, American history, or in another state, it's just really hard for me to wrap my brain around. But one of the ways I sort of get connected with it and sort of makes it easier is reading primary sources, specifically like of people going through this like evangelical awakening. And so you talked a lot about Hajj, right, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, if I'm correct. And so my questions around that are like, is that a specific type of literature? Are people writing like books and poems about their journey? And when you're reading that type of literature, do you see commonalities between what people sort of describe, not just like their surroundings, but the type of experience they have? And so because those commonalities, is the Hajj more a personal journey, or is it like this like type of collective journey, right? So what is its role in Islam? That's a really big question, I'm sorry, but like,
Yeah.
through literature, what do you sort of see as its role in pre-modern Islam?
Oh my gosh, that's a huge question.
Great
And I love
question.
it so much.
Yeah.
So first of all, yes, you have people who are absolutely writing about Hajj experiences, both metaphorical and real. When people write about their Hajj experience, the extent to which, I think one could argue, the extent to which it becomes something that is collective in terms of its outlook, as opposed to it's collective in terms of its import, because ritual binds you to community, right? But like the way that gets really focused on is very much a question of awareness of audience. So when people are writing about their Hajj experiences, are they writing about that for themselves in diaristic fashion, or are they writing that for others? Are they writing it for prospective pilgrims who might try to replicate what they achieved? Are they writing it as a flex to be like, look at me, I did Hajj? Like,
it's like tourist pictures, pre-modern tourist pictures.
Oh my gosh, this was actually a thing that came up in our class during our discussion. Was one of my students who's been on Hajj was just like, yeah, I think it's so weird when people are like taking selfies at the Kaaba. But I'm just like, yeah, people were they were taking pre-modern selfies at the Kaaba, like that's a thing. So all of that is to say, yes. And I think a particularly sort of cool example, again, not from the period that I work with, but one that I sort of used in my class to teach with, and I owe that fact to a colleague of mine whose like syllabi I stole and cannibalized. But I won't.
Dirty secret of all professors, we steal from each other all the time for our syllabi. Absolutely.
Oh, very true. But she turned me onto the Hajj diary. Like, it's called a diary, but it was like written in a way where it was dedicated to the Queen of England fully, and like copies were made that were prestige copies of it, of a woman named Nawab Sikandar Begum, who was one of the Begums of Bhopal, who was basically, and the Begums of Bhopal predated the British Raj, but get absorbed into the British Raj. So Bhopal's like sort of smack dab in central India.
It's in middle of India.
Yeah, I mean,
my aunt lives there, so yeah.
Nice. I'm probably saying it wrong.
It's Bhopal, but that doesn't really matter. You're saying a lot of American words, Arabic words correctly, so
it's whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Bhopal, and she goes on Hajj, and one of the things that the students immediately noticed is she goes on Hajj by a steamship. So they were like, oh, we're in a different period now. People have different modes of travel. And I was like, smart, awesome, wow. Happy teacher moment. But she goes on Hajj, and so first of all, she's a woman who is a viceroy in India, who is Urdu and possibly Persian speaking. I think she was Persian speaking, doesn't speak Arabic, has to have translators the whole time, is hosted by the Sharif of Mecca, who's like someone who like can trace his descent from the Prophet Muhammad, but also like is a him, and it's very much in a sort of patriarchal institution, but also is in a situation where the Arabian Peninsula by then had become sort of a backwater province of the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of poverty around the environs of Mecca and on the road to Medina and all this sort of stuff. And so she talks vividly in her journey about all the hardship of it, the risks that she took, the wealth that she distributes, to the poor and indigent in Mecca. And this is in a like well above and beyond, like supererogatory. You have, of course, your like, Eid sacrifice sort of thing, and like ending Hajj and distributing meat and food. But she's specifically brought like suitcases full of alms to give out to people. She becomes sort of a local celebrity. She's brought the like dowager with her. And she's like, yeah, my mom was like on a camel and this guy tried to steal her camel out from under her and like, this whole thing. And is getting invited into audiences with the Sharif, but also with his wives, which is not an audience to which a lot of other like male members might have been privy and things like that. So she's giving us all of this insight. She's dedicating her diary very cognizantly to the Queen of England. She's very much playing up the fact that this was a big diplomatic mission for her, where she was the munificent party, where she was the progressive party in all of these exchanges, and taking sort of the Sharif and via him, in many ways, the Ottomans to task for various things. And so that's absolutely a collective question that she's raising. That's absolutely, again, a political document, but maybe not collective around the fact of the Hajj itself, which occupies, I think, about a paragraph of this entire story.
Interesting.
Where she says like, oh yeah, I put on ihram, I did my circumambulation, I ran between Safa and Marwa, or I like hurried between Safa and Marwa, I came back, I did my sacrifices, and then I realized, oh no, I have to get to the Sharif's house in time for his little banquet that he made for us, and so I just like zipped. So
it's a Hajj document, but not a Hajj document in some ways.
Right. And like a lot of things are like that. I mean, if you think about like the great travelers from centuries prior, like Ibn Jubayr and Ibn Battuta, who, were coming from Al-Andalus and the Maghreb, and like turning their Hajj journeys into these much larger journeys in order to seek knowledge and in order to dispense knowledge, then again, it's like, yes, the Hajj is there, but there is a chapter within this much longer travel narrative that occupies hundreds of pages.
And so important, and such a great salutary reminder of like paying attention to the sources. And I'm sorry to bring Europe into it again, but Christian pilgrimage narratives from Latin Christian Europe into Jerusalem, for example, Jerusalem takes up like a couple pages. Like it's all about the journey, but these narratives are much longer. And so like we need to pay attention to why they're much longer and what they're paying attention to and what they're devoting so many pages to. They didn't have paper back then, so it was a different whole thing.
Pages of whatever. Pages of dead animals or something.
They're scraping sheep skin and cow skin. Anyway. So we are unfortunately running out of time. So thank you very much. We started off with a 8th century poem about whoring, and Rachel worrying she's going to get fired by her dean for talking about whoring in front of all the students, and we've gone in all sorts of different directions. So if there's one takeaway, pre-modern Arabic literature more than just whoring.
Yeah, it's about everything, which I find fascinating. When is your book coming out? Do you know when your book is coming out?
So it's under contract with the University of Chicago Press, and it's coming out like sometime in late 2023, early 2024. I don't know.
Soonish. That's awesome.
I mean, maybe more like mid 2024. Apparently supply chain's a thing. So I'm gonna just blame it on that. If you have delays, it's definitely not because I'm slow to edit the thing. It's definitely because the Suez Canal.
There's not enough paper. Yeah.
God knows, maybe there'll be another like sideways ship blocking the whole thing again. Who knows? So
right come full circle. Europe didn't have paper in the pre-modern era. We don't have paper now.
That's right. There was a funny story about publishing because I heard about this right when the Bright Ages was coming out, is that a container ship turned over in the Atlantic or the Pacific, I think, and because it was printed in, I think it was India, and it was the entire run of this author's book just like is at the bottom of the ocean now.
Oh, no.
So there's nothing they could do. They had to delay everything. They had to go reset everything. It was like 20,000 copies just like sunk to the bottom of the ocean. So that is a real
books
thing,
are safe,
right?
That happened
because if they're safe,
notes too.
The aliens.
Did it really?
So excited.
Yeah. So he wrote the Rihla 30 years after he took his journey, and supposedly the story goes anyway that his notes were lost at sea, and so he wrote it all from memory, which is like it adds a little curly Q to the whole thing, right?
Wow, that is my worst dissertation nightmare. Literally, whenever I travel now, I have to, because there's this one time where I traveled, I took my hard drive with me. my baby, my 5 terabyte hard drive with all of my dissertation research. It is all backed up online, but I lost that. I don't know where it is. It's somewhere in Portland. And so I come home, I'm like dumping my backpack. I'm like, where's my dissertation hard drive? Where's it? And I have to spend the whole day like pulling it all from different places where it's backed up online. And I have to like redo the backup process because I'm like, this is never happening again. And then I have like regular nightmares where like a solar flare or something like takes out my laptop and everything disappears. I can't imagine how people did it before laptops though, because it's all handwritten. There's a fire.
Well,
how did you do it in the Stone Age, Matt?
It was clay tablets with wax. So we were we just had to give it to the advisor 1 page at a time, and then he would read it or she would read it, and then we'd scrape it, and then we'd have to read it again. It was very time consuming. That's why it took me 8.5 years. So.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I have a question. I realize we have to go, but I do have a question about the languages from your part of the world that I haven't cared enough to learn all the names of. Which is, did you have for your dissertation special characters that people historically had to, if they were even on a typewriter, go in and do the diacritics for, or like handwrite in themselves? Because this is the thing with Islamic studies dissertations.
He's not that old, is he?
No, but he would like, I read typewritten dissertations all the time though. So I figure if you if you're reading someone's typewritten dissertations, you can see the places where they went with a pen and added all the little dots and dashes and macrons, like under and over everything, like in a mania the day before they submitted it, probably. And like, that seems so painful.
So let me say, no, I didn't have to do that. And as soon as this episode is over, I'm going to go crawl into the sea, because I have never felt as old as I do right now.
Like,
I did have computers and we had Microsoft Word and stuff like that. So
I know, but I figured you've read people's typewritten dissertations, because I read people's typewritten dissertations.
I have written, yeah.
I didn't know. I didn't think you were Fred Flintstone. I'm sorry if that's what came out.
To be fair, I have read people's typewritten dissertations, and it is really funny when you see people who are they're talking about texts in Hindi, in Urdu, and sometimes, depending on the country, it's like France. And so you do see the people going in with pen. I find that really funny.
Yeah.
There was an amazing Twitter thread, again, like last thing, I know we're trying to quit, but we're just going to keep going. But like last thing, there was this amazing Twitter thread. I think it was started by Bruce Holsinger, medievalist at University of Virginia, but it was called like, "Thanks for Typing." I don't know if you remember this from a few years ago, which is basically so it was all typewritten or handwritten dissertations and books that were then typeset, but they were all thanked their wives, who did all the research, all the typing, put in handwritten all the diacritics and things and stuff like that. And it was just like, so this is all that unseen labor, right?
This is why I won't get a tenure track job. I don't have a partner to do all that for me. Do you see it? Random question, sorry, real quick. Do you see in early modern Arabic literature people thanking their somebody else for writing everything, right? Does that happen, or are everybody handwriting everything on their own?
So you don't see people thanking people for writing the thing, but you do see like the colophons and manuscripts where people will say like, this was written by XY scribe. This was originally by like, and the author is of course like also usually all over the document. And you do also have scribal manuals where people wrote about the etiquette and decorum of taking dictation sometimes, or of writing documents that were chancery for like sending correspondences from some high official to another high official. But yeah, there's not a lot of acknowledgement culture. There's not even a good citational practice really. So
oh man.
No, certainly in Latin Europe, it's a class issue too, right? Is that like if you were wealthy, like if you were a king, like you're not going to write anything yourself, right? You have people to write for you. You just talk for them. Or if you were a high-ranking church official or something like that. And then even citational practices, like all sorts of all over the place. Like you just quote people, and then you'd expect people to know who you were quoting, and that's just what it is. And that creates lots of problems later on.
It's interesting that there's no early modern Chicago manual of style. I find that interesting. Okay, well.
On that note, so.
On that note.
Yeah, well, if we ever have a time machine, we can go back in time and ask them, like, why, like, guys, footnotes. Let's sum the footnotes, right? So that would solve so many problems. Anyway, that's right. Thank you so much to Rachel for joining us, Rachel Schine, at the University of Maryland. This has been a really wonderful episode. Thank you to you all for spending your Friday evenings with us. This will be up on YouTube as soon as I get around to it tomorrow. Stay tuned if you haven't subscribed to our Substack to hear about upcoming episodes. We have a really great some upcoming episodes. Victor Ray, author of On Critical Race Theory, will be joining us. Brandon Taylor, a novelist, but also a history enthusiast and a video game enthusiast, will be joining us. And Jamel Bowie, the New York Times columnist,
which is super cool.
So much history in his writing, will be joining us later on as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, everybody. And for now, I'll just say one last time, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.